Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, it's good to see you.
Happy New Year, Dr. Paul.
Well, yes, it's a Happy New Year, and we all wish for that. There's a lot of wishes for Happy New Year's, but you know, if you look at current events right now, you wonder who the really happy people are. You know, have you seen some of the statistics about the American people are so unhappy, and the presidential race reflecting this anger and confusion? I think it's always due to confusion on ideas, whether it's foreign policy or monetary policy. That's where the confusion comes. But there is a lot of anger and a lot of unhappiness. And it looks like this first business day of the new year is reflecting some of those concerns, not only here in this country, but worldwide, both in the foreign policy and in the financial sector. And of course, we spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy. We spend a lot of time talking about finances and the Federal Reserve and business cycles. But this weekend was really active with what went on in Saudi Arabia with these 48 individuals who received the death penalty, some by beheading. But most of the talk about that had to do with Nimir, that this was a Shia leader. And of course, the government of Saudi Arabia is Sunni, and he's been in prison for about 4 years. But and a lot of people publicly tried to keep him from being killed. But it seemed like it was, regardless of their religious beliefs and their political beliefs, it didn't make a lot of sense, I would think, to most people, is if you sense that this is enough to create an outcry and maybe riots and closing down embassies and breaking off relations, that they wouldn't have done this. You have any thoughts on this, on why do people do this? I don't even think it's an unintended consequence. It's so blatant, it looks like it could be an intended consequence, but who's to be able to gain from this?
Well, I think, Dr. Paul, this is clearly an explosive situation. And yesterday, the Saudis announced that they were cutting off all ties with Iran after their embassy was attacked by a mob. This I think could escalate very quickly. The sectarian tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran go back a number of years, and we see in the war in Yemen and elsewhere and in Syria, these are sort of proxy wars playing out. But now it's sort of honed in on the two countries themselves. And you see Saudi Arabia has taken some of its allies, the Gulf Arab states, and even Sudan have broken ties. And the Saudis seem to be escalating as well. They've announced today that they will stop allowing their citizens to travel to Iran and stop all air flights. And of course that will affect the Shia minority in Saudi Arabia much more than anyone else. They'd be the ones wanting to travel.
You know, it looks like you could make the case from the public record that it was deliberate on the part of the Saudis to escalate the conflict with Iran. And maybe that's to compensate for the fact that the rest of the world would decided, well, maybe the Iranians aren't quite so bad and we ought to trade with them and talk to them again. But you know, the war that we support Saudi Arabia in, and that is the war against Yemen. So that government, the Saudi government, over the last couple of years has said, well, it's all the Iranians' fault. But now we're getting evidence out now to show that some of the so-called evidence was all fudged, that the Iranians really weren't there putting in weapons, and they might be sympathetic, but the evidence was not there, and I think the Saudi government was caught in fabrication.
Yeah, our friend Garrett Porter, who's done a lot of great work, did a good article a few days ago about how the evidence that Iran was involved and that the Houthis are an Iranian proxy. Well, a lot of people were saying it at the time, but the dominant media sort of ignored that. But he brought out some very specific evidence that this is all manufactured. It's all the usual lies used to cover up war and warmongering.
You know, over the past year, we've talked about Saudi Arabia on several occasions, maybe even longer, because Saudi Arabia sort of comes up, you know, over the 9/11 issue. We had our friend Walter Jones on the program talking about the Senate report. Why can't we read those suppressed 28 pages to find out what the relationship was with the Saudis and the 9/11 terrorists? Of course, 15 of the terrorists came from Saudi Arabia. But we have gone out of our way extremely so, to be close allies. Even some presidential candidates with all of this say, yes, but you have to remember they're our close allies, and we have to stand behind Saudi Arabia. But they have gotten into so much trouble. Take, for instance, what happened during the Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein, that guy, our ally that we built up, he gets misled and he takes over Kuwait. And there was no proof he was going into Saudi Arabia. But that whole war was probably totally unnecessary. But once again, it was Saudi. But the Saudis didn't fight that. They didn't fight that war. So I see a subtle shift here, and I'll get your opinion on this, that maybe our alliance with Saudi Arabia is starting to break a little bit, because it was at a point where we do anything and everything from them and overlook anything at all. But all of a sudden now, I think the tide is turning. They have a new king in Saudi Arabia, and this deliberate precipitation and escalation of this conflict with Iran. This is I think very, very serious, which we have been warning about for a long time, that something like this could break out.
I think you could draw some parallels between the U.S. government's relations with the Saudis and the Israelis. And the Saudis and Israelis in many ways cooperate, but you have had some strains in the relations with the Israelis. We saw over the past few days, this information came out that the U.S. had been, the White House had been looking into Israeli communications with U.S. congressmen as they were actively trying to undermine the U.S.-Iran policy. And so you have tension building there, where a foreign government is trying to manipulate U.S. foreign policy. And with the Saudis, you have the same kind of relationship, where they're trying to manipulate U.S. actions in the regions. I think Syria is a great example. But if you look at the execution of Sheikh Nimr, this all came out of the Arab Spring in 2011, which the U.S. very strongly promoted, some would say even precipitated. And this was supposed to be the people rising up against authoritarian leaders. Well, the U.S. supported that everywhere that it wanted regime change. And in Saudi Arabia, when the people said, okay, we're going to rise up, they said, no, we're going with the government here. And he was one of the leaders of the Shia movement to push for reforms in Saudi Arabia. And he's been, of course, ignored, and the U.S. reaction to the execution, let's put it this way, was very mild.
Right. The move on right now, because of the crisis with Syria and ISIS, it's very popular, especially with Republicans, to come down pretty hard. No more people come in, no Syrians, and no more Muslims. They just can't come in. But at the same time, not only did the Saudis get out of this country generously after 9/11, but right now, where nobody's allowed to come from Syria, and there's strict rules against the Muslim. At the present time, there are 111,000 Saudi students in this country, and which doesn't mean that, we have to crack down on them. It means that sometimes this effort to crack down, I think, is demagoguery and inconsistent and not going to do that much good.
Well, don't forget also that the Saudis spend hundreds of millions of dollars on PR firms inside the Beltway, pushing their image. They also, the Saudis and their allies, the Qataris and others, they prop up a lot of Beltway think tanks. They put in millions of dollars for scholarly papers coming out to support their position. So they've been able to really stay on top of the PR game in Washington.
Well, there's lots of things going on financially in the world and in this country, but in Saudi Arabia, certainly it is. They're in deep trouble financially because the price of oil is low, even though they deliberately did this, I believe, to punish Russia. And Russia was punished, but it's punished American producers too. And that's sort of out of control because Saudi is in trouble this way, and who knows how much motivation they have for that. But we certainly have seen the markets today, January 4th, our first business day. Of course, I look at the markets pretty fast in the morning, look at the international news, and there's always something going on. I said, that's bad, that's bad, bad. But if there's no movement in the markets, the people who hold the big money usually are pretty good at deciding whether it's serious or not. It looks like this is pretty serious because, of course, the stock market is down sharply. I don't know whether it's still down about 400 points, and gold was up sharply, and the dollar was down, but now it's up. So there's a lot of activity going on. I think this new year is going to be quite a bit different. Last year, it turned out to be totally flat. And that was unusual because it was the first time in 8 years. So my guess is that as the year progresses, there's going to be a lot of people worried a lot more about recession in this country. And there's many of us that believe this next go around is going to be worse than the crisis we had in 08 and 09.
Well, you know, the papers claim today that the Dow's precipitous drop this morning was all related to the crisis in the Chinese market, which was down, what, 7% or something. But we were talking before the show, and you said you don't really buy that.
Well, I buy it, but I don't think that's the only thing. That was an event. But I think you have to look a little deeper. I look at markets and they go up or down sharply. And I look at it as there are reasons and there are excuses. I think the Chinese market going down is an excuse, and the turmoil in the Middle East, that's an excuse. But the real reason that a stock market will go down, or the dollar will go down, or the gold will go up is good reason. There's a reason why the Chinese stock market went down 7 points. There was a tremendous amount of malinvestment. There's a bubble out there. We're going into recession not because of China and because of a crisis, but they are the precipitating events. Those are the excuses to bring on the correction. They sort of turn on the switch for the correction that was destined to come. And of course, that big threat has always been papered over with more inflation. You know, we've gone. I did something the other day to show that in the last 15 years, if you had took the advice of our financial experts in the 1990s, late 1990s, buy and hold, buy and hold. I heard that all the time because it kept going up. And yet, if you bought and held your stocks from the year 2000, nominally speaking, without considering inflation, you would have lost about 40% in the NASDAQ. So there's a lot of problems out there. And if you look only at China, for instance, you know, we inflate our money, and then we spend it. We spend a lot overseas. So we get cheap products, and politicians, think that's okay until we lose jobs, which is a natural consequence of it. So we do this. China takes our money, and then they inflate. So they had a bubble there because they monetized our debt. So we more or less exported our inflation. And now, of course, the results are coming back, and eventually it'll end up with, inflation in this country. But I think the markets reflect a business cycle explainable. If you understand Austrian free market economics and the Federal Reserve, it's all there in the same way. And you've spent so much time understanding that foreign policy have consequences too when they get off and do the things that they shouldn't be doing. There'll be maybe blowback or something like that, and of course there's always a cost for it as well.
You talked about gold doing something kind of interesting when these couple of shock waves hit. It stopped behaving like a commodity you mentioned earlier.
Right. People have sometimes criticized pro-gold people, say, oh no, there was a crisis 2 years ago and gold didn't go up, so it's not a money anymore. The people don't go there, they go to Bitcoin or something like that, which hasn't proven to be too much of a haven either. But today, it acted more like a currency. But money sound money is a commodity, and that's what makes it money. It has to be a commodity that is readily exchangeable. You can make it a practical money. So it was money all along, but some people think not. But today it was acting like money and a haven. Certainly in the 1970s, that's what was happening. The dollar was going down and gold skyrocketed, and I've predicted that will happen again. And I have said that there's been two rapid rises in gold. One in the 70s when it went from 35 up to 800, and then from the year 2000 up until a couple years ago, it went from 252 up to 1800. Of course, makes corrections, but I believe we're at this point where gold will once again take off, and it goes, in bits and pieces, but it always ends up higher. And those who predict that, gold is not money and gold is not a haven, they're absolutely wrong, because it's the paper money that is the evil. It's the Federal Reserve that finances our foreign policy. It finances this exporting of our jobs and our inflation, and causing other countries to make mistakes as well. But these events today, there's no way to know whether they will be ironed out and this will blow over. I don't think so. It may become a little bit more quiet, but this whole thing about us drifting away from Saudi Arabia, and the fact that Saudi Arabia seems to want to precipitate more crisis with Iran than we do at the present time. We were the ones that were always doing it. Of course, the president's getting a lot of grief now from the Republicans because he didn't slap on penalizing sanctions on the Iranians. Of course, that causes more problems too.
Yeah, they were developing some defensive missiles, and nobody's allowed to have defenses except our allies.
Yeah, that's about right. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for tuning into our New Year's program, and hopefully we all have a Happy New Year, and there's no reason not, because I believe that people who look for the truth and they understand that even when the truth is negative, you're better off than if you're fooling yourself. Most of the time, people can't fool themselves into thinking, oh, the world is peaceful and it's going to be okay, and ISIS is not a problem, and the Federal Reserve is okay, and deficits are okay, and it won't matter. But if you discover the truth and realize that liberty depends on limited government and emphasis on personal liberty and also on sound money, actually it gives you a reason to be hopeful, and that's where we're making progress. Ideologically, we're making progress, but the ideology has not been accepted by our people in Washington, and this is why people are so angry and upset with Washington, whether it's the foreign policy. Look how upset they got with George W. Bush with his foreign policy, and everybody's upset, and they're upset with immigration and all these things, and rightfully so, but they have to understand the real causes of this if we're going to correct it. But if we just take these as excuses and follow the same programs again, oh, okay, we help precipitate this crisis and there's blowback and they're killing our people, so therefore we want to kill more of them. It's not going to be working. If we end up with too much debt and too much spending and say, what we need is more Federal Reserve, no, that would make me very sad, because generally that's what we've been doing. But if we come around to realizing that the correct ideas are out there and they're based on the moral principle of individual liberty and a peaceful foreign policy, believe me, there's reason to have a Happy New Year. And yet we have to be concerned, and we have to just buckle down and do our very best to spread this message. And it's up to every individual to do it in their way, whatever they can do. And of course, with the help of the internet, the message of liberty and prosperity is spreading. And today is a day that we really have to reassess it, because unfortunately, so often the people in Washington always advocate more of the same, and it's failing. I think the evidence of its failing is going to be very, very clear. Just as communism failed totally and entirely in 1990 and they had to give up on it, not many people are out there and say, let's all go back to Marxism. But too many of them are thinking about fascism and interventionism and corporatism, so that's what we have to challenge. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for tuning into this first program of the new year, and please come back soon.